Annelise's fingers, raw and smudged with dirt, traced the line of a deep fissure in the granite face of the mountain. A cool, damp breath of air, smelling of wet stone and deep earth, exhaled from the darkness within, a stark contrast to the oppressive, sun-baked heat of the August afternoon. It was a secret sigh from the heart of the rock, a promise of something other than the dust and despair that had clung to them for weeks. Her mother, Marion, leaned heavily against the trunk of a gnarled pine, her face a pale mask of exhaustion, the fine lines around her eyes etched deeper by hardship. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs, a half-empty water cask, and the worn-out mule tethered loosely to a low-hanging branch, its head drooping in defeat. Just 3 weeks prior, their world had been a small, rented farmhouse with a porch that caught the morning sun and a field that yielded just enough to get by. Then Mr. Croft, the landowner, had arrived, his face set like a grim winter sky. The railroad was buying up the valley, he'd said, his voice devoid of sympathy. The lease was terminated. He had given them 2 days. Annelise remembered the hollow sound of her own voice, pleading for more time, for a sliver of mercy. She remembered the cold finality in his eyes as he gestured to the land. It wasn't his concern. The world was moving on, and they were simply in its path. They had packed what little they owned onto a rickety wagon, a pathetic collection of memories and necessities. Her late husband's tools, a few quilts Marion had stitched, a cast iron pot. But the wagon's axle had shattered 2 days into their aimless journey, spilling their meager life into the dust of a forgotten road. They had salvaged what they could carry, sold the broken wagon for a pittance to a passing farmer, and bought the weary mule. Now, they were here, at the foot of the gilded peaks, guided only by a fragment of a story her husband, Samuel, used to tell, a tale from his own grandfather about a hidden place, a hunter's refuge somewhere deep in these woods. It had been a fanciful story for a winter's night, not a map for survival. Yet it was all they had. The fissure was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was a dark, uninviting maw, a crack in the world's foundation. Annelise looked back at her mother, whose breath came in shallow, ragged puffs. Fear was a cold knot in Annelise's stomach, but desperation was a fire at her back, pushing her forward. She took the water skin from the mule and looped its rope more securely around the branch. "Stay here," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I'll just look." Marion gave a slow, tired nod, her eyes closing as if the effort of watching was too much. Annelise took a deep breath, the scent of pine needles and hot dust filling her lungs for the last time before she turned and faced the darkness. She slipped sideways into the crack, the rough, cold stone scraping against her shoulder and hip. The passage was narrow and tight, pressing in on her from both sides. It was utterly black for a few feet, a suffocating, timeless void where the only sound was the scuff of her worn boots on the gritty floor and the frantic beat of her own heart. She felt a surge of panic, a primal urge to retreat back to the sun and open air, but the image of her mother's exhausted face propelled her forward. She pushed on, one hand braced against the wall in front of her, the other trailing along the rock beside her. The passage began to curve, and a faint, greenish light appeared ahead, growing steadily brighter. The air grew cooler, richer, carrying the distinct, life-affirming scent of moss and running water. She moved faster, her hope surging, and then she stumbled out of the passage and into the light, blinking against the sudden, impossible beauty of it all. She was standing in a small, circular valley, no bigger than a generous pasture, walled in on all sides by sheer cliffs of grey granite. The sun poured down into it like honey, illuminating a scene of impossible lushness. A thick carpet of emerald green moss and wild grasses covered the ground. A small, clear stream meandered through the center, fed by a slender waterfall that cascaded down the far rock face, its sound a gentle, constant shushing that filled the hidden space with peace. Wild berry bushes grew in thick clusters, their branches heavy with dark, ripe fruit. It was a sanctuary, a world apart, pristine and untouched. Near the base of the waterfall, half overgrown with creeping vines, were the remnants of a life lived long ago, a low, rectangular stone foundation and the collapsed remains of what must have been a small sod shelter. A wave of profound, shuddering relief washed over Annelise, so powerful it buckled her knees. She sank to the ground, pressing her face into the cool, damp moss, and for the first time since the eviction notice, she allowed herself to weep. Annalise scrambled back through the narrow passage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The sunlight of the outer world felt harsh and hostile after the gentle luminescence of the hidden valley. "Mother," she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Mother, you must see." Marian's eyes fluttered open, weary and clouded with a deep, settled despair. But something in her daughter's face, a wild, shining hope she hadn't seen in years, made her stir. With Annalise's help, she rose slowly to her feet, her joints protesting with every movement. The journey through the fissure was arduous for her. Annalise went first, talking her through it, her voice a steady, encouraging presence in the suffocating dark. Marian's breath hitched with fear in the tightest section, her hand trembling as it gripped Annalise's shoulder. But they pressed on, inch by painful inch, until they too emerged into the sun-drenched sanctuary. Marian stopped dead, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, which had for so long seen only hardship and loss, now widened to take in the impossible scene. The waterfall, the stream, the verdant green, the profound, sheltering silence broken only by the music of moving water. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "Samuel's story," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. It was real. They walked slowly toward the ruins, their footsteps silent on the soft moss. The stone foundation was expertly laid, the work of a patient and knowledgeable hand. The stones were large and flat, fitted together with a precision that had defied the seasons. The sod structure built upon it had long since collapsed, its earthen roof and walls having returned to the soil, leaving behind a mound of rich, dark loam and a few rotting timbers. The space within the foundation was small, barely 10 feet by 12, but it was a footprint of home. It was a start. As Annalise began to gently clear away some of the debris, her fingers brushed against something hard and smooth beneath the decayed wood. Carefully, she dug around it, pulling away the damp earth and rotted vegetation. It was a small, tin box, rusted but still intact. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling fingers, she worked at the lid, prying it open with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, nestled in what was once a protective wrapping of oilcloth, lay a small collection of treasures more valuable than any gold. There was a sturdy, well-made axe head, its edge still keen beneath a thin layer of protective grease. Beside it lay a small, sharp hatchet, a hammer, a handful of wrought iron nails, and a folded, double-bitted saw blade, its teeth still sharp. And beneath the tools, a small, leather-bound journal. Annalise lifted it out. The leather was stiff and the pages were yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. The first page contained a brief inscription. Thomas Weatherby, 1842. For my son, should he ever need a place of peace. Samuel's grandfather. The mysterious benefactor. Annalise opened the journal, her eyes scanning the neat, deliberate script. It was not a diary of feelings, but a practical guide. It detailed the construction of the original shelter, the best places to find dry wood, which berries were safe to eat, and how the stream ran pure and clean year-round. The final entry was a letter, addressed to no one and everyone. If you have found this place, you are in need. Do not despair. The earth is a hard mother, but she is a giving one. Use these tools. Rebuild. Live. The mountains will keep you safe. Annalise read the words aloud, her voice thick with unshed tears. Marian reached out and placed a hand on her daughter's arm, her touch a silent acknowledgement of the gift they had been given. It was more than a shelter, it was a legacy of survival, a message of hope sent across the decades. The sun began to dip below the high granite walls of their new world, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The air grew cool. They had a foundation. They had tools. They had a chance. The first days were a blur of grueling, relentless labor. Their immediate priority was to clear the foundation and salvage what they could from the old structure. The work was slow and backbreaking. Annalise used the hatchet to chop away the thick, tangled roots of the vines that had woven themselves into the earth of the collapsed roof. Marian, despite her age and frailty, worked with a quiet, uncomplaining determination. She gathered the smaller pieces of rotted wood, separating them into a pile for kindling. Her movements were slow, her breaths often shallow, but she did not stop. She sorted through the rich soil of the collapsed walls, her gnarled fingers finding edible roots and tubers that had grown wild within the ruins. They worked from the first light that spilled over the eastern cliffs until the last rays faded in the west, their bodies screaming with the protest of unused muscles. Annalise's hands, accustomed to darning socks and kneading dough, were soon blistered, then calloused. Her back ached with a deep, constant fire. In the evenings, they would sit by the stream, soaking their sore feet in the cold, clear water, too exhausted for conversation. The silence between them was not one of distance, but of shared purpose, a deep, unspoken understanding of the monumental task that lay before them and the terrible consequences of failure. They subsisted on the berries that grew in abundance and the roots Marion found, roasting them over a small, carefully tended fire built in a shallow pit a safe distance from their work site. The mule, which Annalise had painstakingly guided through the fissure, grazed peacefully on the lush grass, its presence a comforting link to the world they had left behind. After 3 days, the foundation was clear. The flat, grey stones lay exposed to the sun, a clean, solid rectangle promising stability. They had also amassed a respectable pile of kindling and a few larger, half-rotted timbers that might be used for bracing or furniture. But now the real work began, building the cabin itself. The journal mentioned a stand of straight, tall pines in the northeastern corner of the valley. Annalise took the axe head and the hammer, and after a long search, she found a stout, straight branch of hardwood that she could fashion into a handle. The process of fitting the head to the handle was clumsy and difficult, but after hours of whittling and hammering, she had a crude but functional axe. The weight of it felt alien and immense in her hands. She stood before the first pine, a towering giant whose top seemed to touch the sky. She felt impossibly small, a frail human pitting her will against the ancient strength of the forest. Her first few swings were awkward, glancing off the thick bark. But she remembered her husband once showing her the proper way to chop firewood, the rhythm of it, the way you let the weight of the axe do the work. She set her feet, breathed deep, and swung again, and this time the blade bit deep into the wood with a satisfying thud. Chips of pale wood flew into the air, smelling sharply of resin. She worked until her arms felt like lead and sweat dripped into her eyes, blinding her. Marion watched from a distance, her hands clasped tightly together, her face a mixture of fear and pride. The first tree took the better part of a day to fell, but its final, groaning surrender and the thunderous crash as it hit the ground was the sound of victory. It was the first log for their new home. The felling of that first tree established a new rhythm for their lives, a cadence measured in the swing of an axe and the slow setting of the sun. Each morning, Annalise would leave the small camp they had made by the stream and walk to the stand of pines, the axe a familiar weight on her shoulder. The initial awkwardness gave way to a hard-won proficiency. She learned to read the grain of the wood, to place her cuts with precision, to feel the moment a tree was ready to give way. The forest, which had at first seemed an intimidating and monolithic entity, became a resource she could understand and work with. The sharp, clean scent of pine sap was a constant presence, clinging to her clothes and her hair. The rhythmic thwack of the axe against wood became the valley's heartbeat, a testament to her unyielding effort. While Annalise labored among the trees, Marion took on the equally vital tasks of sustenance and preparation. Her knowledge of plants, learned from her own mother, was a lifeline. She foraged tirelessly, her basket filling with late-season berries, hardy greens, and edible mushrooms that she identified with absolute certainty. She laid them out on flat rocks in the sun to dry, creating a small but growing store of food for the winter that was already a looming presence in their minds. She used the small hatchet to limb the fallen trees, her movements methodical and efficient, stripping away the branches and sorting them into piles, larger ones for fuel, smaller twigs for kindling. She became the quiet quartermaster of their small operation, ensuring that no part of the forest's gift was wasted. The days bled into one another, marked only by the growing number of felled logs lying on the forest floor. The physical toll was immense. Annalise's body was a canvas of aches and pains. Her shoulders burned, her hands were a mass of calluses, and every night she would fall into a deep, dreamless sleep born of pure physical exhaustion. Yet, with each new day, she found a deeper well of strength within herself. The quiet provider archetype that had defined her role as a wife now manifested in a raw, physical power she never knew she possessed. Her love for her mother, her fierce determination to protect their fragile new life, was channeled into every swing of the axe. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Marion reached over and took Annalise's hand, turning it over to look at the hardened palm. She said nothing, but her thumb gently traced the lines of the calluses, a silent acknowledgement of her daughter's sacrifice. Annalise simply squeezed her mother's hand in return. Words were unnecessary. The logs piling up at the edge of the clearing spoke for them. They were the sentences in a story of survival, each one a declaration of their refusal to be broken. The air began to carry a new crispness, a subtle chill that hinted at the changing season. Their race against time had begun in earnest. Moving the logs from the forest to the building site was a monumental challenge. Each one was immensely heavy, far too much for one person to lift. Annalise tried at first to drag one, her boots slipping on the mossy ground, the log barely moving, the effort leaving her gasping for breath and deeply discouraged. For a day, they were at an impasse, the neat pile of logs a testament to their labor but also a symbol of an insurmountable obstacle. It was Marion who found the solution. She had been watching her daughter struggle, her mind working quietly. "Your father," she said, her voice soft but clear, "he used to move stones for a wall. He never lifted. He rolled." She pointed to a smaller, rounder log. "Levers." And rollers. The concept was simple, yet it was a revelation. Using smaller, stout branches as levers, Annalise found she could lift one end of a log just enough for Marion to slide another smaller, round log underneath. With 2 or 3 of these rollers in place, they could push the massive timbers across the uneven ground. It was still incredibly slow and demanding work, requiring perfect coordination and immense effort, but it was possible. They developed a silent, synchronized rhythm. Annalise would strain with the lever, her muscles trembling, and Marion would be ready, shoving the next roller into place at the precise moment. They moved as one, their shared goal creating a powerful, unspoken bond. The first log they managed to roll onto the stone foundation felt like a greater victory than felling the entire stand of trees. It was tangible proof of their ingenuity and their partnership. One by one, they moved the logs, laying the first course of their new home. The next challenge was notching them so they would fit together at the corners. Annalise studied the instructions in the journal, which described a simple saddle notch. Using the axe and the sharp hatchet, she painstakingly chopped and carved the curved notches into the ends of the logs. Her first attempts were clumsy, the fit loose and uneven. But she persevered, her frustration tempered by a growing patience. She learned to measure with her eye, to feel the shape of the wood, to shave off slivers until the fit was snug. As the walls began to rise, a new problem emerged, lifting the logs into place. For the first few courses, they could manage by lifting one end at a time. But as the walls grew higher than their shoulders, they had to devise another solution. They built ramps of earth and stone against the walls, allowing them to roll the logs upward and into position. It was dangerous, precarious work. A single slip could send a log tumbling down, crushing anyone in its path. They worked with a heightened sense of caution, communicating with brief, direct commands. Now steady it a little more. The cabin grew, course by painstaking course, a rugged, sturdy structure rising from the ancient stones. It was not perfect. The logs were not uniform, and the gaps between them were uneven. But it was theirs, built not just of wood, but of their own sweat, desperation, and unyielding will. It was becoming a home. With the wall standing at a little over 6 feet high, their attention turned to the 2 most critical components for surviving the coming winter, a roof to keep out the snow and a hearth to provide warmth. The journal offered guidance on both. For the roof, Thomas Weatherby had used a simple pitch design, strong enough to shed a heavy snow load. Annalise felled several more slender pines, which they stripped and laboriously hoisted into place to serve as rafters. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of the construction. Annalise had to climb onto the top of the unsteady walls, balancing precariously as she notched the logs and set the rafters, while Marion stood below, passing up tools and offering quiet words of encouragement that were more valuable than an extra pair of hands. Once the frame was secure, they needed to create the roof itself. They lacked the tools and materials for proper shingles. Instead, they followed the journal's instructions for a sod roof, a technique common in harsh climates. They laid a thick lattice of smaller branches and stripped bark over the rafters, creating a dense mat. Then came the arduous task of cutting large squares of sod from the valley floor. They used the hatchet and a sharpened, flat stone to slice through the thick turf, lifting heavy sections of earth and grass. They hauled these squares up a makeshift ladder and laid them tightly over the branch lattice, grass side up. Finally, they sealed the seams with a thick plaster made of clay dug from the stream bank and mixed with dried moss and water. It was messy, exhausting work, but when it was done, they had a living roof, a thick, insulating blanket that would protect them from the elements. Simultaneously, they began construction of the fireplace. The foundation already had a designated spot on the north wall where the stones were thicker. They carefully dismantled that section of the log wall and began building the hearth and chimney. This was Marian's domain. Her father had been a stonemason, and she had watched him work as a child, absorbing the logic and artistry of it. She selected stones from the stream bed and the surrounding cliffs, judging their size and shape with a practiced eye. Annalise did the heavy lifting, bringing the stones and mixing the clay mortar, but Marian directed the placement of each one. "No, that one is too round," she would say, pointing with a dirt-caked finger. "We need a flat face here." It must draw properly. She worked with a focused intensity, creating a deep, solid firebox and a tapering chimney that rose steadily against the outer wall. It was a slow, meticulous process, but the structure that emerged was a work of simple, functional beauty. The day they finished, a cold wind was whipping through the valley, stripping the last of the golden leaves from the aspens. They stood inside their small, dark cabin, the wind whistling through the unchinked gaps between the logs. Annalise arranged a small pile of the driest kindling in the new hearth and struck a spark with her flint and steel. The kindling caught, and a small flame flickered to life. She gently added larger twigs, then a small log. The fire took hold, and for the first time, warmth and a soft, dancing light filled the small space. Smoke billowed for a moment, and then, as if by magic, the chimney began to draw, pulling the smoke up and out. A steady, comforting roar filled the hearth. They stood side by side, watching the flames, their faces illuminated by the warm glow. They had a roof over their heads. They had a fire to warm them. They had a home. The first snowflake was a silent, stark warning. It drifted down from a sky the color of slate and melted on Annalise's cheek as she carried a load of firewood. The sight sent a jolt of urgency through her, a cold fear that called in her gut. Winter was no longer a distant threat, it was at their door. The final preparations became a frantic, desperate race against the weather. Their most pressing task was chinking the walls. The gaps between the logs were wide enough to let in the wind and the snow, making their shelter little more than a sieve. They spent days gathering moss from the forest floor, pulling it up in great, damp sheets. They mixed it with more clay from the stream bank, creating a thick, fibrous daub. Together, they worked their way around the cabin, inside and out, forcing the mixture deep into every crack and crevice. It was cold, messy work. The clay numbed their fingers and caked their clothes, but they worked relentlessly, their movements economical and swift. As they sealed the last gap, the change inside the cabin was immediate and profound. The whistling wind was silenced, replaced by a deep, insulated quiet. The small structure suddenly felt like a true sanctuary, a fortress against the coming cold. While Annalise finished the chinking, Marian focused on their food stores. She had amassed a considerable collection of dried berries, mushrooms, and roots, but it was not enough. Every day, she would venture out, her basket on her arm, searching for the last of the autumn bounty. She dug for cattail roots in the marshy area near the stream and gathered the last of the rose hips, their bright red a stark contrast to the browning landscape. They also needed a secure place to store their provisions, safe from moisture and the few small animals that inhabited the valley. Annalise dug a small root cellar in the corner of the cabin floor, lining the pit with flat stones and creating a sturdy wooden lid from leftover timber. They carefully packed their dried goods into sacks sewn from spare bits of cloth and arranged them in the cool, dark space. The largest task remaining was firewood. A small fire for cooking was one thing, a fire that needed to burn day and night to keep them from freezing was another entirely. Anneliese returned to the forest with the saw and the axe. The double-bitted saw, which she had painstakingly fitted with 2 handles, allowed them to work together. Anneliese on one end, Marion on the other, they pulled the blade back and forth, its teeth singing as they bit through the thick pine logs. The work was exhausting, a test of endurance that pushed them to their limits. They cut the logs into manageable lengths and then Anneliese split them with the axe, her movements now powerful and sure. The pile of split wood grew steadily, a bulwark against the winter. It stacked against the eastern wall of the cabin, rising higher and higher until it was a formidable, reassuring presence. They worked until their muscles screamed and their hands were numb with cold, driven by the knowledge that every log they cut and stacked was another day of life, another day of warmth. The snow began to fall in earnest the evening they stacked the last of the wood. They retreated into the cabin, barred the simple wooden door Anneliese had constructed, and huddled by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. The small, amber-colored light of the fire danced on the rough-hewn walls. The scent of wood smoke and drying herbs filled the air. They were surrounded by the fruits of their labor, a roof that did not leak, walls that held back the wind, a fire that gave warmth, and a cellar full of food. They had done it. They were ready. The world outside their cabin walls vanished under a thick blanket of white. The snow fell for 3 days without ceasing, burying the valley in a deep, silent drift. The waterfall froze into a magnificent, crystalline sculpture, and the stream became a ribbon of dark water moving sluggishly beneath banks of snow. For Anneliese and Marion, the world shrank to the 10 by 12 feet of their shelter. A deep, profound quiet settled over them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind as it scoured the high cliffs. Their lives fell into a simple, monastic routine. Mornings were for chores. Anneliese would clear a path to the woodpile, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and bring in enough wood for the day. Marion would prepare their simple breakfast, usually a thin porridge made from ground cattail roots, sweetened with a few dried berries. The days were long and quiet. They mended their worn clothing by the light of the fire, their needles moving with slow, deliberate stitches. Marion would sometimes tell stories from her childhood, her voice a soft, comforting murmur in the stillness. Anneliese would listen, her hands busy, grateful for the sound that filled the silence. They rationed their food carefully, aware that the winter could last for months. The isolation was both a comfort and a weight. They were safe, utterly hidden from the world that had cast them out. But they were also completely alone. Some days, a sense of crushing loneliness would descend upon Anneliese. She would stare into the fire, the memory of her husband's laugh or the feel of his hand in hers a sharp, sudden pain. She worried about her mother's health, watching her for any sign of a cough or a fever, knowing that in this place, there would be no doctor, no help. But Marion remained a source of quiet strength. Her resilience was not in physical power, but in her unwavering spirit, her ability to create a sense of home and normalcy in the most desolate of circumstances. One afternoon, a blizzard descended on the valley with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a living thing, and the snow beat against their small cabin, testing every seam. Anneliese lay awake all night, listening to the assault, feeling the walls vibrate with the force of the storm. She was certain the roof would be torn away, that their small fortress would be breached. But the cabin held. Thomas Weatherby's foundation was solid, and their own labor had been true. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world transformed, sculpted into fantastic shapes of white. It was in the second month of their isolation that the world intruded. Anneliese was outside, splitting a log, when a sound made her freeze. It was the crunch of snowshoes. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the axe and flattened herself against the cabin wall, her mind racing. Who could possibly be here? She peered around the corner and saw him. A tall, lean man, dressed in furs, his face weathered and bearded. He was standing near the frozen waterfall, staring at the thin wisp of smoke rising from their chimney, his expression one of utter disbelief. He hadn't seen her yet. He carried a long rifle, but it was held loosely in one hand, not at the ready. He took a hesitant step toward the cabin. Anneliese's knuckles were white where she gripped the axe handle. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to protect the sanctuary she and her mother had built with their own blood and sweat. This man was an intruder, a threat from the outside world they had so desperately fled. But there was nowhere to run. He had seen their smoke, he knew they were here. The man took another slow step forward, his eyes fixed on the small, sturdy cabin. He stopped about 50 feet away, a respectful distance. He unslung the rifle from his shoulder and leaned it carefully against a snow-covered boulder, a clear gesture of peace. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, his voice a low baritone, rough but not unkind. It was a sound that felt alien in their silent valley. Annalise remained frozen, hidden by the corner of the wall. Inside, she knew Marion would have heard, would be standing just as still, her heart pounding. The man waited patiently. He did not move closer. "Not looking for trouble," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold, still air. "Name's Hemlock. I've been trapping this range for 20 years. Never seen smoke in this valley before. Thought my eyes were playing tricks on me." Annalise slowly, cautiously, stepped out from behind the cabin, the axe still held tightly in her hands. She did not raise it, but its presence was a clear warning. She positioned herself between the stranger and the cabin door. She studied him. He was older than she first thought, perhaps 50. His eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they held no malice, only a deep, weary curiosity. He looked at her, then at the axe, and gave a slow nod of understanding. "Didn't mean to alarm you," he said. "It's a hard country to be alone in. Just wanted to make sure you were all right." His directness was disarming. He was not asking questions, not demanding anything. He was simply stating a fact. Annalise found her voice, though it was raspy from disuse. "We're fine." The words were clipped, meant to end the conversation. Mr. Hemlock nodded again. "Glad to hear it. That's a well-built cabin. Good chinking. You'll stay warm." He glanced at the massive woodpile. "And you've laid in your supply." Smart. His practical, approving words chipped away at her fear. This was not a man looking to cause harm, he was a man who understood the language of survival, who recognized and respected the work they had done. The cabin door opened a crack, and Marion's face appeared in the opening. Her expression was wary but calm. The stranger touched the brim of his fur hat in a gesture of respect. He said to Marion. He turned his gaze back to Annalise. "I'll be on my way. I've got a camp a few miles north. If you find yourselves in need of anything, well, I'll pass this way again in the spring. Maybe we can trade. I've got furs." Always in need of dried herbs for medicine, he picked up his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and with a final nod, he turned and began walking away, his snowshoes making a soft, rhythmic crunch as he disappeared back the way he came. Annalise stood watching until he was gone, the axe slowly lowering to her side. The silence of the valley settled back in, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of complete isolation. They were not entirely alone in the world. The long winter finally broke. It did not happen all at once, but in a series of small, hopeful signs. The days grew noticeably longer, the sunlight holding a new warmth. The great ice sculpture of the waterfall began to weep, then to trickle, and finally to roar back to life, its sound a triumphant proclamation of the thaw. The deep snows receded, melting away to reveal the damp, dark earth, which smelled rich and fertile and full of promise. Annalise and Marion emerged from the cabin, blinking in the bright spring light like creatures waking from a long hibernation. They had survived. The root cellar was nearly empty and the woodpile was drastically diminished, but they were healthy. They had endured the worst the mountains could throw at them and had come through, not just intact, but stronger. A profound sense of accomplishment settled over them, a quiet, deeply rooted pride. The valley floor transformed into a carpet of new green shoots and the bright, cheerful faces of wildflowers. The work began again, but this time it was not a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. It was the hopeful, life-affirming work of cultivation. They cleared a patch of land near the stream, where the soil was richest. Annalise turned the earth with a crude spade she fashioned from a flat stone and a sturdy branch, her movements strong and sure. The hard labor of the autumn had honed her body, stripping away all but essential muscle and sinew. Marion, her energy renewed by the return of the sun, followed behind, breaking up the clods of earth with her hands and pulling the stubborn roots of weeds. They were preparing a garden, a place to grow their own food, to put down roots in this hidden soil just as they had put down the foundations of their home. As he had promised, Mr. Hemlock returned. He appeared one afternoon at the mouth of the fissure, carrying a large sack over his shoulder. He greeted them with the same quiet respect as before, and this time Anneliese invited him to sit by their small outdoor fire. He did not overstay his welcome, but he shared news of the outside world, of the continued progress of the railroad, of a mild winter in the lower valleys. It all sounded like a story from another lifetime. Before he left, he opened his sack. He had brought them a side of smoked venison, a bag of salt, and, most precious of all, a small cloth pouch filled with seeds. Corn, beans, squash, and hardy greens. A fair trade for some of that yarrow I saw growing near the cliffs, he said, though they both knew the seeds were worth far more. Anneliese accepted the pouch with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. She and Marion spent the next day planting, carefully placing each seed into the prepared earth. As Marion pressed a bin seed into the soil, she looked up at Anneliese, her face illuminated by the soft afternoon light. "This is a good place," she said simply. Anneliese looked around their valley, at the sturdy cabin, the clear, running stream, the newly planted garden, the granite walls that kept them safe. It was more than a good place. It was a world they had built for themselves, a testament to their resilience. The hardships were not over, life here would always be a challenge. But as she looked at the rows of freshly turned earth, she felt a powerful, unshakable sense of peace. They were not refugees anymore. They were home.